Hi, welcome to some fat quarter ideas with GourmetQuilter. I'm Susan Clare, GourmetQuilter, and we're doing a whole series on things that you might do starting out with 20 fat quarters, and we're adding some borders and bindings and a few bits here and there, but we're using the 20 fat quarters over 20 projects. Just basically we wanted to see how far we could go with 20 fat quarters. So I started out with, as I said, the 20 stack, and we've cut them all up. So there is a pattern available with all the different things that we're doing. We're doing one different idea each day for 20 days until we get to 20. And we are up to idea number, I don't know which one we're up to, 9, I think. And we are going to be making, this time, a little fabric basket. So this is kind of fun. So what we've been doing is making, we've done quilts and cushions and all sorts of things. And sometimes we've been making something and I've suggested that we keep the leftovers. So when we made this fabric wallet, little folding wallet with pockets in it, with these pieces that we put on here, we had some little triangles that we trimmed off that I suggested we keep to use later. And it's those that we're using this time. So that was from project 7. So I kept all my little offcuts of the triangles because we had done some double lines of sewing and we trimmed away these. Didn't need them for that project. I thought we'd use them for this one. So I've gone ahead actually and already done most of them, but we need to trim them all and we can then join them all together into a little strip. So I still need this one, but I thought I'd leave one just to show you. They're a little bit wonky. Usually when you trim off those triangles like that, they don't seem to ever be quite the way you'd like them to be. And it is fabric. Fabric moves. It's not always going to sit exactly as we think it should. It has a little mind of its own, I think. So I'm just going to trim them. So I press them all open first, and I'm just going to pop the diagonal line of my square right along that diagonal line of the sewing. And they're not very big. I'm just going to trim them. They're just 1.5 inches trimmed. So there's a little bit of room to trim. We do need to trim them because you can see they're not particularly well shaped anyway, but they're also not all the same size. Weirdly, even though they came from the same sort of place, they seem to all be just a little bit different. So I'm just placing that diagonal of the ruler on the diagonal and then just making a note of where that measurement is until we get a nice trimmed square. And I think that's looking excellent now. So now, and we needed exactly the right number of what was left from the wallet. So we've used up all of the little triangles or half square triangle units that were left over in this one project. So that's pretty exciting. It's really nice when you can use every little thing up, I feel. So I'm just going to join that to this row because I'll need to have it on here. And then we can get started on making the little basket itself. I've already done some of the work. So I've just been pressing the seams all one way when I've been joining this up. It's working pretty well, and it comes out the size I'm looking for. And that's partly because we've trimmed it all so that we've got all the right size to start with. And then when you join things together, if they start out the right size, chances are they're going to end up the right size. So in order to make this fun little basket, so we've got this band of these little half square units all the way around. We've got some binding on the edges here. We've bound this side seam as well, so it's all kind of nicely enclosed, and it's got 2 little handles. So so we're going to be binding it with this dark grey fabric this time. I think that's quite nice. We're using the orange instead of the green. And then this is my lining. And then I've just got this piece of batting here. This is a, I don't actually know what its proper name is. I was told it was bag batting when I bought it. It's quite firm, it's quite thin, but solid. So it makes really nice things like this where you want them to hold their shape quite well, but still be quite soft. So I've got my batting and my lining. They're the same size. And now I just need to join up. So there's a whole panel. So we have a strip up the side here, then we've got this wider piece here, and then I'd need to put this one on here and this one as well to make up that main bag unit. So this is really just straightforward sewing. It's just a 1/4 inch seam to join this in here. So I might go ahead and get that in there so that I can show you how we're going to, we need to do a little bit of quilting perhaps on it, just some straight line work perhaps, and then from there onwards. So I've joined that together, everything fits really nicely. The batting and the lining are just a touch bigger at the moment because we're going to do a little bit of quilting on here, and I'm just going to do some straight lines. All I did on here was a couple of lines either side on the narrow bits and then a few along there just to hold it all together nicely. So I'm just going to do some straight line sewing. So when I joined all these little triangles up, because they were already joined in pairs of the little half square units, I just picked them up and sewed them together. I didn't try and organise them or anything like that, and I just think they look really nice all together actually. So now I'm just going to do some straight line quilting, nothing hard about this. I'm going to go 1/4 inch either side of that line there to start with, and then I'll, as I said, I'll do some in between as well. So I think I'll go ahead and get this done and then show you how we make it up. So I've done some stitching on here and I'm just trimming it up now. So we're just trimming off all the extra batting and lining. So we're just trimming to the front piece, and then we're going to cut out some little bits so that we can start joining it all up. So exciting. So this will be a square now. And then we've got this in the pattern. There'll be a shape to use for this next part. What we're going to do is cut out 2 little bits here so that we can join this. This ends up being joined here, but we don't want all this here. So we're going to remove that first. So I found the easiest way is to fold it in half and then have the pattern piece and position that on there. And so what I actually find I like to do is mark it on there, and then I just cut it out with some scissors, because it's a bit, you can't really get a rotary cutter into that so much. And if you do it on the fold, it's pretty straightforward. So we cut this away so that it's a little bit like making corners like we do on the bottom of some bags, but if we cut away we don't have to worry about trying to line up for corners and things. So this works really well, and we're going to bind all the edges of the seams so that we don't have any raw edges showing inside our little basket, so that's kind of fun too. Look at that, perfect. Weird shape, hey? But it works. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do these little, these are the side seams that we're going to join up here, and we're going to cover them with some binding. So I've cut some strips of fabric here for binding and things. So this is going to be my top binding. These are going to be the little handles, and then these bits here are going to be what we're going to put over here. They're a little bit longer than they need to be, just to give us a bit of wriggle room. So it's just a strip with the raw edges folded into the centre, and we'll be stitching it over the seam. But first we're going to do the seam. So we're going to actually sew the seam wrong sides together. So we're going to sew both of these 2 short seams, then try and press the seam open a little bit. Just a regular 1/4 inch seam is fine, and so it doesn't really allow a lot for opening it, but it's probably better if we can just press it open once it's done. So I'll go ahead and get these 2 stitched, and then we'll put the binding over that as well. Bring the iron over and show you. It's probably just as easy to do one at a time. So we've got a nice tidy seam on the inside now. And then on here, if we sort of turn it in and then try and press that open as much as we're able. This batting is fairly firm, so it's a little bit resistant to this whole concept. However, we're going to encourage it. If we can. You could actually, having pressed it open, you could then stitch it down if you wanted it to actually sit flat, because it's probably going to want to not sit flat even under the binding, but it works pretty well, I've found, if you can just get it to press reasonably. So that we've got that seam done there, and we want to put this piece of binding over the top of that to cover that over. So I found the easiest way is probably to pop a couple of pins in. You can fold back the binding to see where the centre is, where those raw edges are meeting, and you can pop a couple of pins in just to hold it so that it's sitting central to the seam as much as anything, and then we can stitch it down either side. And it's probably a little bit hard for you to see because it gets all caught up in there. So I'm actually going to start at the top edge in this corner here and come down one side, and then I'll come down the other side as well. But I don't know if you're going to be able to see, because like I said, it's a little tricky getting in here. I can see it. Probably not a lot of help to you. So I'll show you the one side so you can see what I'm doing. So it's sitting over that pressed open seam, and I've come all the way down this side here. So now I need to do the same on that side. It's just easier if you start at that corner. You can go this way. Maybe I can do it this way. Let's see if you can, then you can see what I'm doing. I just found it wasn't quite as easy to keep it flat coming this way. Oh, we're doing fine. Can you still see? So there, we've still got a gaping hole, but we've got a nicely bound seam. It's all tidy. So I'll go ahead and do the other one, exactly the same as we've just done, and then I can show you the next step. So I've done both ends now. I'm just going to trim these excess lengths of that binding off. We don't need that anymore. It just gave us a little bit of wriggle room, and we wriggled. And then we're going to sew up these bottom corners. So we're going to have an exposed binding on the outside corners. Again, it leaves it nice and tidy on the inside. So to do that now, we're going to stitch across here. So we're just going to have it so that these corners come out like that. And I'm going to put the binding on as I go. I've machine bound mine, so I'm sewing it on just like I do on a quilt, and then I rolled it up and I've stitched it down to this side here. So in that case I want to include my binding at the same time. So this is just a folded strip of fabric. I'm going to centre that so that all the raw edges are level together, and I'm just going to stitch that seam all the way along. And now I'm going to flip that over and sew it by machine. If you wanted to do it round by hand, like a quilt binding, you can of course do it that way. I'm going to do it this way. So it's gone on to the bottom there, and I'm going to roll it up to the front. But we've got these little bits sticking out here, so I'm just going to fold that in just a little bit more than the seam allowance on that corner bit there, so that when that folds in, that just brings that corner down just a touch. And then I can bring that down to there, and then you can pop a pin in if you want to hold that till you get to the sewing machine. And we're just going to be stitching along that edge, and we're going to do the same thing at this end. So fold that little bit of seam allowance up a little bit so that when you fold that along, it brings that top corner so that it sits inside when we fold that down. I can pop a pin in there and we can stitch it and we will have that corner all done. I usually just like to back up to the end and then get going again. Now this little row of stitching may or may not show on the back side, in which case you may or may not like to do it by machine. And you can see it on the back side, but it's absolutely fine to be there. So that's how I bound the corner. So we've now got our little ends and our corner, and I think that's looking great. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll get the other one done and then show you. We've got to pop the handles on as well. I've already made the handles. They were just a strip of fabric, raw edges in and then over again, and I've stitched them either side. They need to be positioned on this top edge here, either side of that seam that we've bound there, with a gap between them. So I'll go ahead and get all that done, and then we've got to put the top binding on, which I've already got ready. That was also a strip of binding that I joined into a loop. I've just joined it and pressed the seam open, and then I've just pressed it all in half so the raw edges are together. So I'll go ahead and get this all ready to do all that with. So I'm going to do my other corner like that, and I'll just position my handles in place. This basket is so much fun. So I've finished off my corners. I've started getting my binding in there. I've attached the handles either side of this seam to the inside, because we're going to be putting the binding on and they're going to pop up because the binding comes, the stripe is the binding here, so that comes to the outside. So I've gone ahead and got all those on, and I just marked my binding. So remember, it's double, we'd made a loop, and I've just marked the quarter points with some pins, and again I've marked halfway on the sides. There's a seam here, so we didn't need to mark that one, just so that we can position this in place, because it's pretty much the right size, so we want it to fit nicely. So just put a couple of pins in around, and then you can probably ease it around as you go if you need to. It'll probably fit though. So that's looking like it's going to fit really well. So I'm going to stitch it in place with my 1/4 inch seam all the way around the top edge there. So there's nothing tricky about this. It's really just a matter of making sure that you go all the way around the top. So I will show you when I've done all that to show you how we do the next bit. So I've finished sewing that, and I'm just flipping that. I've actually just run around with the iron so that to help encourage that seam to sit down. And I'm just going to do 2 lines of stitching around there now. So I'm going to stitch maybe about 3/8 of an inch from the fold so that it encloses the seam, and then I'll stitch again close to the fold of here. So there'll be 2 lines of sewing on there. And it's probably easier to turn it in the other way to be able to get into that, to be able to sew that in there. So you've just got to make sure everything sits nice and flat and stays out of the way. It's nice to make these things. They're different to make than a quilt, I have to say. So about 3/8 of an inch, a bit more than the 1/4, just to allow that 1/4 inch seam allowance of the batting and everything to sit within this, what we're doing at the moment. Can you see it? So nothing particularly hard about it. It's fairly straightforward. It's just making sure that that sits down and that the seam's all sitting nice at the top on this top edge here where it folds over. So I'll go ahead and get this stitched and show you when I get to the other end. So that's it. I've finished. I've gone round the 2 times with the stitching around that top binding, It's all super tidy on the inside, super tidy on the outside. We've used up all those nice little pieces that seem such a shame to waste, and we haven't wasted them. I think we've put them to very good use. So that was project number 9, the little fabric basket. I hope you've enjoyed that. I've enjoyed doing it. I love these little baskets, they're so useful. So thank you, and I will see you again with the Fat Quarter idea number 10.